Sometimes life takes everything from you before it gives you everything back. At 58, Jake Porter had nothing left but $10, a faithful horse named Lucky, and the bone-deep weariness of a man who'd lost it all. When he bought that abandoned ghost town for his last $10, Jake figured he was buying a place to die quietly. The crumbling buildings felt like the perfect reflection of his broken dreams. But Lucky had other ideas, wandering to that boarded-up saloon like he knew something Jake didn't. What Lucky discovered beneath those rotting floorboards would change everything. A buried fortune worth over $200 million. But when word spreads about Jake's incredible find, will he choose easy money or something more valuable? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the high desert as Jake Porter sat on the tailgate of his battered pickup truck, holding a piece of paper that had once meant everything to him. The ranch deed was worn thin from handling, its edges soft as old leather, the ink faded but still legible. Porter Family Ranch, established 1987, 35 years of sweat, dreams, and backbreaking work, reduced to a document he could no longer afford to keep. Jake folded the deed carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart where it belonged. At 58, he should have been looking forward to slowing down, maybe teaching his grandson how to rope cattle or fix fence posts. Instead, he was sitting in the parking lot of a roadside diner with everything he owned loaded in the back of a truck that might not make it through another winter. "Well, Lucky," he said, glancing back at the horse trailer where his quarter horse stood patiently. "Looks like we're starting over whether we like it or not." Lucky's ears pricked forward at the sound of his name. The horse had been Jake's constant companion for 12 years, through good seasons and bad. Through the divorce when Sarah finally had enough of ranch life and lean years. Through the bank meetings that got progressively more uncomfortable until they stopped being meetings and became foreclosure notices. Jake slid off the tailgate and walked to the trailer. Lucky stretched his neck over the rail, and Jake scratched behind his ears the way the horse liked. "You're about the only thing they couldn't take away from me, old friend." Though Lord knows they tried, the banker had suggested Jake sell Lucky to help cover the debt. The suggestion had been met with a stare so cold that Mr. Henderson had actually taken a step backward and cleared his throat nervously. Some things weren't for sale, no matter how desperate a man got. Jake had been desperate, though. The kind of desperate that makes a man consider things he never thought he would. The ranch had been in trouble for 3 years running. Cattle prices stayed low while feed costs climbed. Equipment broke down faster than he could fix it. The drought of 21 had been the beginning of the end, and the harsh winter that followed finished what the dry spell started. Sarah had seen it coming long before Jake accepted it. She'd been patient at first, understanding when he worked 18-hour days, trying to keep their heads above water. But patience has limits, especially when pride keeps a man from asking for help or admitting defeat. The day she packed her bags, she'd stood in their kitchen that would soon belong to the bank, and said, "I'm not watching you kill yourself for a piece of land that's already gone. Jake, I love you too much for that." He'd been too stubborn to see she was right. Too proud to admit that sometimes loving something means knowing when to let it go. By the time he came to his senses, Sarah was living in town with her sister, and the divorce papers were signed with the same pen he'd used to sign away the ranch. Now here he was, 3 weeks later, with nowhere to go, and $10.47 to his name. Most men his age would have family to turn to, friends with spare rooms, something to fall back on. But Jake had spent so many years focused on the ranch, so consumed with keeping it running, that he'd let other relationships wither like crops in drought. He opened the trailer gate and led Lucky out to stretch his legs. The horse moved with the easy grace of an animal that trusted his human completely, despite everything they'd been through. That trust was humbling. Jake had lost almost everything else through his own stubborn mistakes. But Lucky's faith in him remained unshaken. Guess we better figure out what comes next, Jake murmured, running his hand along Lucky's neck. The horse's coat gleamed copper in the morning light, muscles moving smoothly beneath. Lucky was still in his prime at 12, still had years of good riding ahead of him. Jake wondered if the horse understood that those years might not be spent on wide-open rangeland anymore. The diner's screen door banged open, and an elderly waitress emerged with a pot of coffee. "You boys look like you could use a warm-up," she called, approaching with the casual kindness that seemed to come naturally to people who worked in places like this. "That's mighty kind of you." "Ma'am," Jake replied, accepting the steaming cup gratefully. "Haven't seen many like him, have you?" He nodded toward Lucky. "Quarter horse?" she asked, and when Jake nodded, she smiled. "My late husband raised them. That's a fine-looking animal. Bet he's got good bloodlines." "The best," Jake agreed. "His grandfather was a cutting horse champion. This one's got the same instincts, the same intelligence. Sometimes I swear he knows things before I do." As if responding to the praise, Lucky lifted his head and looked toward the horizon, ears forward and alert. Jake followed his gaze, but saw nothing except sagebrush and distant mountains. Still, he'd learned to pay attention when Lucky acted like that. The horse had a way of sensing things, weather changes, trouble, sometimes even opportunities, that went beyond normal animal awareness. The waitress refilled Jake's cup and studied him with eyes that had seen plenty of hard luck stories. "You headed somewhere particular, or just headed away from somewhere?" Jake considered the question. "Both, I suppose. Lost my ranch a few weeks back. Now I'm looking for a place where an old cowboy and his horse can start over without needing much money to do it." She nodded thoughtfully. "You know, there's a tax auction happening over in Cedar Falls today. Sometimes there are properties that go cheap, real cheap, if you're not particular about location or condition." "How cheap?" Jake asked, though he suspected anything worthwhile would be beyond his modest means. "Last year a fellow bought an old mining claim for $23. Of course, it was just a hole in the ground with a shack, but it was his hole in the ground." She smiled. "Today's paper is inside if you want to look at the listings." "Can't hurt to dream a little." Jake thanked her and walked back toward the diner, Lucky following without being led. Inside, he found a copy of the local paper and turned to the legal notices. Most of the properties listed for auction had minimum bids in the thousands, but a few caught his attention. An abandoned farmhouse with no road access. A lot in a subdivision that was never developed. And then, at the bottom of the list, something that made him read twice. Millfield Township, including all structures and improvements. Minimum bid, $10. Jake had exactly that, plus 47 cents. He read the description again. The township consisted of a main street with several commercial buildings, a church, and multiple residential structures, all abandoned since the early 1960s, located 43 miles northeast of Cedar Falls, accessible by maintained county road. Jake sat back in the booth and stared at the listing. A whole town for $10. There had to be a catch, environmental problems, legal complications, something that made the property worthless. But the listing seemed straightforward enough. The county just wanted to clear it off the tax rolls. He looked out the window at Lucky, who was standing patiently by the truck, still gazing toward the mountains, as if he could see something in the distance that wasn't visible to human eyes. Maybe it was crazy. Maybe it was the desperate act of a man with no other options. But something about the idea of owning a whole town, even a dead one, appealed to Jake in a way he couldn't quite explain. He'd spent his adult life working land that belonged to the bank, fighting to make payments on a dream that was never really his. What would it feel like to own something outright, even if that something was just a collection of empty buildings in the middle of nowhere? Jake folded the newspaper and left it on the table. Outside, he loaded Lucky back into the trailer and climbed behind the wheel of his truck. The engine turned over on the third try, which was better than average lately. "Well, Lucky," he said, adjusting the rearview mirror to see the horse's face. "How do you feel about being the mayor of a ghost town?" Lucky's ears flicked forward, and for a moment Jake could have sworn the horse nodded. The Cedar Falls courthouse was older than Jake by at least 3 decades, its red brick facade weathered by mountain winters and desert summers. A small crowd had gathered on the front steps for the monthly tax auction, mostly local investors and curious onlookers, hoping to snag a deal on foreclosed property. Jake parked his truck and trailer on a side street, leaving Lucky with a hay net and the windows cracked for air. "This might be the most expensive cup of coffee I ever bought myself," he muttered, patting his shirt pocket where the $10 bill rested against his old ranch deed. Inside, the auction was being held in a courtroom that had seen decades of disputes over land, water rights, and property lines. About 30 people sat in the wooden pews, some with thick folders of research, others just killing time on a Tuesday morning. Jake took a seat in the back, his worn boots and faded jeans making him blend in with the other working folks. The auctioneer was a thin man in his 60s named Harold Tibbs, according to the nameplate on the table. He had the rapid-fire delivery of someone who'd been calling auctions since before Jake started ranching, but his manner was friendly rather than intimidating. "Morning, folks. We've got 17 properties on the docket today, so let's get started. First up is a residential lot on Maple Street, 1/3 acre, minimum bid $500. Jake half listened as properties came and went. The serious bidders were easy to spot. They had notebooks, calculators, and the confident air of people who made money buying other people's problems. A developer in an expensive suit bought 3 lots in a failed subdivision for $8,000. A woman who introduced herself as a property manager snapped up a duplex with foundation issues for $12,000. The morning wore on, and Jake began to wonder if he was wasting time he couldn't afford to waste. His $10 might buy him lunch and a tank of gas, assuming his truck could make it to wherever he was planning to go next, which he still hadn't figured out. Then Harold Tibbs shuffled his papers and cleared his throat. "Now we come to item 16, which is a bit unusual. Millfield Township, located 43 miles northeast of town, off County Road 247. This includes all structures within the township boundaries. That's approximately 24 buildings on 47 acres. Property has been abandoned for over 60 years. A murmur went through the crowd. Someone in the front row chuckled. "What are you supposed to do with a ghost town, Harold?" "That's between you and your imagination, Earl," Harold replied with a grin. "All I know is the county wants it off the tax rolls. Minimum bid is $10. Jake's heart started beating faster. He looked around the room, waiting for someone to raise their hand. The developers were checking their phones. The property manager was packing up her purse. Nobody seemed interested in a collection of empty buildings in the middle of nowhere. "Do I hear $10? Harold called. Jake's hand went up before he fully realized he'd decided to bid. $10, he called out, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. Harold looked genuinely surprised. "We have $10 from the gentleman in the back." "Do I hear 15? The courtroom was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the scratch of Harold's pen on his notepad. Jake could feel people turning to look at him, probably wondering what he planned to do with a ghost town. "Going once for $10, Harold said. "Going twice." He paused, giving anyone who might have changed their mind one last chance. "Sold to the cowboy in the back row for $10. Just like that, Jake Porter owned a town. The reality of it hit him as he walked to the front of the courtroom to complete the paperwork. He was signing documents with a pen that skipped, using his last $10 to buy property he'd never seen, making a decision that was either the worst mistake of his life or the first smart thing he'd done in years. "You'll need to take possession within 30 days, Harold explained, sliding the deed across the table. "Property taxes will start accruing next year, but they shouldn't be more than a couple $100 annually for land this remote." Jake folded the deed, thick paper, official seals, the kind of document that meant something permanent, and tucked it in his wallet next to his driver's license. "Is there anyone I should contact about utilities? Water, electricity?" Harold shook his head. "Been cut off for decades. You're looking at generator power, well water if you can get a pump running. It's rough living out there, son. You sure you know what you're getting into?" "No, sir," Jake replied honestly. "But I reckon I'll figure it out." Outside the courthouse, Jake sat on a bench and unfolded the deed to read it properly. The legal description was dense with surveyor's language, but the meaning was clear. He now owned every building, every street, every square foot of ground within the Millfield Township boundaries. The deed was dated today and signed by the county clerk in blue ink that was still damp. A woman approached from across the street, the property manager who'd been buying buildings all morning. She was probably in her 40s, professionally dressed, with the confident stride of someone accustomed to making deals. "Excuse me," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Linda Morrison. I couldn't help overhearing your purchase back there. Mind if I ask what you're planning to do with Millfield?" Jake shook her hand. "I'm Jake Porter, and I honestly don't know yet." "Seemed like a good deal for the price?" Linda laughed. "Everything's a good deal for $10. But you should know, there's no road maintenance out there, no services, no nothing. My grandfather used to tell stories about Millfield back in his day. It was a silver mining town, pretty prosperous for a while, but when the mines played out in the 1890s, people just drifted away. By the 1960s, it was completely empty. Your grandfather was from there, born there in 1903, used to say it was a beautiful place, nestled in a little valley with a creek running through it. Of course, that was before it became a collection of empty buildings." She paused, studying Jake with professional interest. "You wouldn't be interested in selling, would you? I've got clients who collect unusual properties. Might offer you a nice profit." Jake considered it. He could probably make a few $100s, maybe even 1,000, just by turning around and selling to someone with more money and less sense. It would be the practical thing to do. "I appreciate the offer, Mum, but I think I'll hold on to it for now. See what I've gotten myself into." Linda nodded and handed him a business card. "Well, if you change your mind, give me a call. And be careful out there. It's pretty isolated." Jake watched her walk back to her car, a new SUV with dealer plates, then looked down at the deed in his hands. What had he done? He'd bought a town he'd never seen, with money he couldn't afford to spend, on the word of a newspaper listing and the recommendation of a diner waitress. But as he walked back to his truck, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. For the first time since losing the ranch, he was moving towards something instead of just running away. Lucky nickered softly as Jake approached the trailer. The horse had finished his hay and was standing alert, looking northeast toward the mountains. Jake followed his gaze and wondered if Lucky could somehow sense their destination. 43 miles away down a county road that led to a town where nobody had lived for 60 years. "Well, Lucky," Jake said, climbing into the driver's seat. "Looks like we're going to be neighbors to a bunch of ghosts." The first thing that struck Jake about Millfield was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of early morning on a ranch, where you could still hear cattle lowing in the distance or the whisper of wind through grass, but a profound stillness that seemed to press against his eardrums. Even the sound of his truck engine died away quickly in the thin mountain air, leaving only the creak of settling wood and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Jake pulled up in front of what had once been the town's main street and turned off the engine. Through his windshield, he could see the skeleton of a community that had been frozen in time. A row of false-fronted buildings lined both sides of the dirt street, their weathered wood bleached silver-gray by decades of sun and snow. Some still had glass in their windows, others showed only dark rectangles where windows used to be. "Lord Almighty," Jake breathed, stepping out of the truck. "What have I gotten us into, Lucky?" The horse trailer rocked gently as Lucky shifted his weight, eager to be let out after the long drive. Jake walked to the back and opened the gate, and Lucky backed out with the careful precision of an animal that had learned to trust small spaces and uneven ground. The moment Lucky's hooves touched the earth of Millfield's main street, his behavior changed. His ears pricked forward, and he lifted his head high, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. Then, without any direction from Jake, he began walking toward the largest building on the street, a two-story structure with bat-wing doors and a faded sign that read, "Morrison's Saloon." "Whoa there. Partner," Jake called, but Lucky had already reached the saloon's front porch. The horse stood perfectly still, staring at the boarded-up entrance as if he could see through the weathered planks to whatever lay beyond. Jake followed, his boots echoing on the wooden boardwalk. The porch was solid enough, though it creaked under his weight. Someone had nailed sheets of plywood over the doors and windows years ago, but the wood was sound, and the building seemed structurally intact. Above the covered entrance, a second-story balcony overlooked the street, its ornate railings testament to the town's former prosperity. "Something interesting about this place, Lucky?" Jake asked, scratching behind the horse's ears. But Lucky remained focused on the building, shifting restlessly, as if he wanted to go inside. Jake spent the next hour exploring the rest of the town. Millfield had been laid out in a simple grid, Main Street running east-west through the center, with 3 cross streets dividing the town into neat blocks. Besides the saloon, there was a general store with living quarters upstairs, a church with a bell tower, a blacksmith shop, and about 20 houses of various sizes scattered throughout the residential blocks. Most of the buildings were in better condition than Jake had expected. The dry mountain climate had preserved the wood, and whoever had been the last to leave had taken care to board up windows and secure doors. There was damage, of course, a few collapsed roofs, some broken windows where boards had come loose, but nothing that couldn't be repaired by someone willing to put in the work. Jake decided to make the general store his temporary headquarters. It had a large main room with shelves lining the walls, a pot-bellied stove for heat, and stairs leading to living quarters on the second floor. The previous owner had left behind an odd collection of items, a few canned goods with labels so faded they were unreadable, some kerosene lamps, and a calendar from 1962 still hanging on the wall behind the counter. He unloaded his meager possessions from the truck: a sleeping bag, some basic camping gear, and a duffel bag containing all the clothes he owned. Lucky's worn leather saddle, cracked from years of use but still supple with careful maintenance, went on a wooden sawhorse that made a perfect saddle stand. The saddle had been Jake's father's and his grandfather's before that. 3 generations of porters had worn smooth the leather on that cantle, and Jake found comfort in its familiar presence. "Home sweet home," Jake said to Lucky, who had wandered back to the general store and was peering through the front window. "What do you think? Better than sleeping under a bridge?" Lucky's only response was to walk back toward the saloon. Again, he stood in front of the building, this time pawing at the ground with one front hoof. Jake followed and found himself studying the boarded-up entrance more carefully. The plywood was secure, but there was a gap at the bottom where the boards didn't quite meet the porch decking. Through that gap, Jake could smell the faint scent of old wood and something else, a mustiness that spoke of long years and forgotten secrets. "You know something I don't you, boy?" Jake murmured. Lucky's ears flicked toward him, then back toward the saloon. The horse had always been intuitive, but this behavior was different, more intense, more purposeful. As evening approached, Jake made a simple dinner on a camp stove he'd set up in the general store. Canned beans and instant coffee. Not much different from meals he'd eaten in line shacks during Roundup, except for the profound silence that surrounded him. On the ranch there had always been sounds: cattle moving, wind through the trees, the distant hum of highway traffic. Here the only sounds were the ones he made himself. "Gets a man to thinking," Jake said to Lucky, who was standing outside the store's front window. "About what matters, about what doesn't, about all the noise we surround ourselves with just to avoid hearing our own thoughts." Lucky's ears swiveled toward him, and Jake could have sworn the horse understood every word. They'd been partners for 12 years, through good times and lean times, and Jake had gotten into the habit of talking to the horse when there was no one else around to listen. It had never felt strange on the ranch, where horses were considered good listeners and better secret keepers than most people. But here in this empty town, his voice seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings, making him more aware of just how alone they were. After dinner, Jake walked the perimeter of the town as the sun set behind the mountains. The view was spectacular, peaks and valleys stretching to the horizon in shades of purple and gold. He could see why people had settled here, why they'd built homes and businesses and tried to make a life in this remote valley. The town sat beside a creek that still ran clear and cold, and there was good grazing in the meadows beyond the residential area, but he could also understand why they'd left. Without the mines to support it, Millfield was too isolated, too far from markets and services to sustain a community. The people who'd built these homes and businesses had probably moved on to places with better opportunities, leaving behind only the structures that had once housed their dreams. As darkness settled over the valley, Jake returned to the general store and spread out his sleeping bag on the wooden floor. Through the front window, he could see Lucky silhouetted against the stars, standing guard in front of the saloon like a sentry on duty. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out how to get inside that building," Jake promised. "See what's got you so interested." Jake's third morning in Millfield started like the previous two, with Lucky standing in front of Morrison's saloon, staring at the boarded-up entrance as if willing it to open. The horse had developed what could only be called an obsession with the building, returning to it throughout each day like a faithful parishioner visiting church. "You're going to wear a path in that dirt," Jake called from the general store's front porch, where he was drinking coffee from a tin cup and watching the sunrise paint the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold. Lucky's ears flicked toward him, but the horse didn't move from his post. The daily routine Jake had established was simple by necessity. Wake at dawn, check on Lucky, make coffee, spend the morning exploring different buildings, take lunch and water to wherever Lucky happened to be standing guard, work on small repairs in the afternoon, and end the day with another circuit of the town before settling in for the night. It wasn't much of a life, but it was peaceful in a way Jake hadn't experienced since childhood. No creditors calling, no bank notices in the mail, no decisions more complicated than which building to examine next. The silence that had seemed oppressive at first was becoming familiar, even comforting, but practical matters couldn't be ignored indefinitely. His supplies were running low, and the nearest town was Cedar Falls, 43 miles of winding mountain road away. Jake loaded Lucky into the trailer and made the drive, partly for supplies and partly to see how the outside world looked after 3 days of complete isolation. The hardware store in Cedar Falls was run by a man named Pete Jameson, who recognized Jake from the courthouse auction. "You're the fellow who bought Millfield," Pete said, not quite making it a question. "Word gets around fast in a small town. That's me," Jake admitted, loading fence staples and basic hand tools into a shopping cart. "Place needs some work," Pete laughed. "I bet it does. Haven't been out there in years, but I remember it being pretty run down, even when I was a kid. My dad used to take me fishing in that creek that runs through town. Said the trout fishing was good because nobody bothered them anymore." As Jake paid for his supplies, Pete leaned across the counter with the conspiratorial air of someone sharing local gossip. "Folks are curious about what you're planning to do out there. Some think you're crazy, spending money on a place that's been dead for 60 years. Others figure you know something they don't." "Maybe I am crazy," Jake replied. "Haven't decided yet myself." At the grocery store, the cashier, a young woman with kind eyes and an easy smile, asked similar questions. "Are you really living out in that ghost town?" "By yourself." "Me and my horse," Jake said. "We're not much for company anyway. Isn't it spooky? All those empty buildings?" Jake considered the question as he loaded groceries into his truck. "Not spooky exactly. More like sad. You can see where people tried to build something permanent, something that would last. They just ran out of time and money before they could finish." The drive back to Millfield gave Jake time to think about those conversations. The people in Cedar Falls seemed to view his purchase as either folly or eccentricity, but no one questioned his right to waste his own money on a lost cause. There was something refreshing about that level of indifference to other people's business. Back in Millfield, Jake found Lucky exactly where he'd expected, standing vigil in front of the saloon. But this time, the horse wasn't just staring at the building. He was pawing at a specific spot near the base of the front steps, scraping away decades of accumulated dirt and leaves. "What have you found, boy?" Jake asked, kneeling to examine the area Lucky had been working. His fingers brushed against something hard and rectangular buried in the debris. He worked it free and found himself holding a piece of thick glass in an ornate metal frame. A photograph. Protected by the frame from decades of weather, Jake carried his discovery into the general store and cleaned it carefully with a damp cloth. What emerged was a professional photograph of Millfield's main street, taken sometime in the 1880s based on the clothing and carriages visible in the image. But this wasn't the ghost town Jake knew. This was a thriving community. The street was bustling with activity. Well-dressed men and women walked the boardwalks between shops that displayed their wares in large windows. Children played in the dirt street under the watchful eyes of their mothers. Horse-drawn wagons loaded with supplies stood in front of businesses. The saloon, Morrison's Saloon, according to the painted sign clearly visible above its entrance, had customers coming and going through doors that stood wide open to the mountain air. Every building Jake could see in the photograph still stood today, but the difference was profound. In 1885, Millfield had been alive with purpose and possibility. People had invested their hopes and energy here, believing they were building something permanent. Jake studied the photograph for a long time, paying particular attention to the saloon. In the image, it was clearly the town's social center. Men in suits and work clothes gathered on its wide porch, and through the open doors he could see the shadowy interior packed with customers. A sign in one window advertised fresh beer daily, and another promised rooms available. The more Jake studied the photograph, the more he could envision what Millfield had been like in its prime. The general store where he now slept had been a hub of commerce, selling everything from flour and coffee to mining equipment and women's fashions. The church had hosted weddings and funerals, its bell calling the community together for Sunday services. The houses had been homes where families raised children and dreamed of prosperous futures. That evening, as Jake made his simple dinner, he found himself looking at the current buildings with different eyes. What he'd been seeing as decay and abandonment, he now recognized as evidence of craftsmanship and care. The joinery was solid, the proportions pleasing, the details thoughtful. These structures had been built to last by people who took pride in their work. For the first time since arriving in Millfield, Jake began to see possibilities instead of just problems. The buildings were sound. The location was spectacular. The creek provided water, and the surrounding valley offered natural resources. What if someone with time and determination decided to breathe life back into this place? The thought was both exciting and terrifying. Jake had failed to save his own ranch despite 3 decades of experience and community support. What made him think he could resurrect an entire town that had been dead for 60 years? But as he prepared for bed, Jake found himself making mental lists of what would need to be done. Roofs repaired, windows replaced, utilities restored somehow. Gardens planted, maybe some livestock brought in. It would take years of work and more money than he had, but it wasn't impossible. Just difficult outside, Lucky had taken up his usual evening post in front of the saloon. In the moonlight, the horse looked almost ghostly himself. A living guardian watching over secrets that had been buried with the town's past. "Tomorrow," Jake promised, speaking to Lucky through the store's front window, "we figure out how to get inside that building. See what's got you so convinced there's something worth finding in there." Jake had been studying the saloon's boarded-up entrance for 10 minutes, looking for the best way to remove the plywood without damaging the original structure underneath. When Lucky pawed impatiently at the ground and moved toward the building's side porch, the horse nudged something with his muzzle, then looked back at Jake with an expression that seemed almost human in its expectancy. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked, following Lucky to investigate. The horse had uncovered something metallic, half buried beneath the porch steps, a large, ornate skeleton key, its iron surface crusted with rust but still intact. Jake brushed the dirt away and held it up to the morning light. The key was beautifully crafted, with decorative scrollwork on the bow and teeth that looked hand-filed. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake murmured. "Lucky, you might just be the smartest horse in 3 counties. The key fit perfectly into the front door's lock, which had been hidden behind the plywood barrier. With some effort and a generous application of penetrating oil Jake had brought from town, the mechanism turned with a satisfying click. The sound seemed to echo through the empty street, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Jake worked carefully to remove the boards from the front entrance, using a pry bar to avoid damaging the original woodwork. Each piece of plywood that came away revealed more of the saloon's elaborate facade: carved door frames, etched glass panels, and brass hardware that had somehow survived decades of neglect. When the last board fell away, Jake stood before Morrison's saloon's original batwing doors. Their red paint faded, but their brass hinges still solid. Beyond the doors, the interior was lost in shadow. Lucky stepped forward without hesitation, pushing through the batwings with the confidence of a regular customer, leaving Jake no choice but to follow. The first thing that hit Jake was the smell, not the musty odor of decay he'd expected, but something else entirely. Beneath the dust and age was the ghost of what this place had once been: tobacco smoke, spilled whiskey, leather, and the indefinable scent of human gathering. It was the smell of a place where people had come to forget their troubles and share their joys, where stories had been told and deals had been made. As Jake's eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through gaps in the boarded windows, the saloon's interior began to reveal itself. The main room was larger than he'd expected, with a magnificent mahogany bar running along the left wall. Behind the bar, an enormous mirror, somehow unbroken despite decades of abandonment, reflected Jake's surprised face back at him. Ornate gaslight fixtures hung from a stamped tin ceiling, and the original hardwood floors, though covered with dust, appeared to be in remarkable condition. Tables and chairs stood scattered around the room, exactly as they'd been left by the last customers. Some chairs were pushed back, as if their occupants had just stepped away for a moment. Others were overturned, suggesting the final night in Morrison's saloon might have been more eventful than usual. Playing cards lay scattered on one table, a poker hand interrupted by history. "This is incredible," Jake breathed, running his hand along the bar's polished surface. The craftsmanship was extraordinary: inlaid wood details, hand-carved trim, brass fixtures that would have cost a fortune even in the 1880s. Someone had invested serious money in making Morrison's saloon a showplace. Lucky, meanwhile, had moved with purpose toward a specific area near the far end of the bar. The horse stood perfectly still, head down, staring at a particular section of floor, as if he could see through the wooden planks to whatever lay beneath. Jake joined him, kneeling to examine the floorboards. This area looked different from the rest. The planks were slightly newer, the wood grain running in a different direction. Someone had replaced a section of the original floor, probably decades ago, based on the wear patterns. "You see something down there, don't you, Lucky?" Jake asked. The horse nickered softly and pawed at the floor with one hoof, producing a sound that seemed subtly different from the solid thunk of hoof against wood. More hollow, somehow. Jake tested the boards with his hands, pressing down to check for give or movement. One plank about 3 feet from where Lucky stood felt loose. When Jake pressed harder, he could feel it shift slightly, as if the nails holding it in place had worked free over the years. But before he investigated further, Jake wanted to explore the rest of the building. A staircase at the back of the main room led to the second floor, where he found a series of small rooms that had once served as lodging for travelers. Each room was simply furnished: a bed, a washstand, a chair, but the attention to detail was remarkable. Hand-carved headboards, real brass door handles, windows that offered spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. The largest room, at the front of the building above the main entrance, had clearly been reserved for special guests. It featured a 4-poster bed, a writing desk, and French doors that opened onto the balcony overlooking Main Street. Standing on that balcony, Jake could see the entire town spread out below him, and beyond it, the valley that had once supported a thriving community. Back downstairs, Jake spent time examining the bar more closely. Built-in cabinets still held bottles of liquor so old their contents had evaporated, leaving behind only colorful glass containers with faded labels. The cash register was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering, solid brass with mother-of-pearl keys and elaborate scrollwork. When Jake tentatively pressed one of the keys, the drawer sprang open with a cheerful ding, startling Lucky and making Jake laugh out loud. The sound of his own laughter echoing in the empty saloon was somehow both comforting and melancholy. Jake could easily imagine this room filled with customers, the bar busy with activity, conversations flowing as freely as the beer and whiskey. Morrison's saloon had been the heart of the community, the place where miners came to celebrate good strikes and drown their sorrows after bad ones. As the afternoon sun slanted through gaps in the window boards, Jake found himself making mental calculations. The building's bones were solid. Better than solid, they were magnificent. The roof needed work, certainly, and the windows would have to be replaced. But the foundation was sound, the walls were plumb, and the interior spaces were not just functional but beautiful. More importantly, Jake realized he was no longer thinking in terms of what it would cost to maintain the building, but what it would take to restore it. The difference was significant. Maintenance was about preventing further decay. Restoration was about bringing something back to life. "What do you think, Lucky?" Jake asked. "Think this old place has another act in it." Lucky had returned to his position above the loose floorboard and was pawing at it again, more insistently this time. The sound was definitely hollow, as if there was empty space beneath the floor. Jake knelt and worked the loose board with his hands until he could get his fingers underneath it. The plank came up easily, revealing a gap in the floor large enough for a man to reach through. But the late afternoon shadows made it impossible to see what, if anything, was in the space below. "Tomorrow," Jake promised Lucky. "First thing in the morning. We'll bring a flashlight and see what's got you so interested. But right now, we better get back to the store before it gets dark." As they prepared to leave, Jake took one last look around the saloon's main room. In his mind, he could see it restored. The mirror gleaming, the brass polished, the tables occupied by customers who appreciated the craftsmanship and history surrounding them. It would take years of work and more money than he currently had, but it wasn't impossible, just difficult. And Jake Porter had never been a man to back down from difficult. The next morning, Jake returned to the saloon armed with a powerful flashlight and a growing sense that Lucky's obsession with the loose floorboard was about to pay off. The horse was already waiting by the front entrance when Jake arrived, pawing at the ground with the same restless energy he'd shown every day for the past week. Inside the saloon, the morning light filtering through the gaps in the window boards created a pattern of golden shafts and deep shadows that made the empty room feel almost alive. Jake knelt beside the loose floorboard and worked it free, then directed his flashlight beam into the gap below. The space beneath the floor was larger than he'd expected, not just the area under a few loose planks, but what appeared to be a deliberately constructed hiding place about 3 feet square and 18 inches deep. And it wasn't empty. Jake's light illuminated several objects wrapped in what looked like oiled canvas, a leather-bound book, a small wooden box, and something metallic that gleamed dully in the flashlight beam. He reached down and carefully lifted out the book first, unwrapping it to find a journal bound in cracked leather with pages yellowed by age. The cover bore an inscription in faded gold lettering, "Property of Samuel Morrison. Proprietor." Jake opened it carefully, mindful of the brittle paper, and found himself looking at the handwritten records of Millfield's last saloon keeper. The early entries were routine business notes, inventory lists, customer tabs, records of shipments received. But as Jake flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The handwriting became more hurried, the entries more personal and increasingly desperate. June 15th, 1892, the Henderson mine closed today. That's 3 mines shut down in 2 months. Men are leaving town faster than they came during the boom. Business is down to nothing but the diehards who won't admit the town is finished. June 28th, 1892. Mayor Wilson left for Denver yesterday with his family. Didn't even say goodbye, just loaded a wagon and drove away like the place was on fire. Can't blame him, but it stings nonetheless. 20 years we've known each other. July 4th, 1892. Celebrated Independence Day by myself. Not a single customer all day. Used to be we'd have a dance in the street and fireworks until midnight. Now there's nobody left to celebrate with. Jake found himself drawn into Morrison's story, imagining the man writing these entries by lamplight in the empty saloon, watching his world dissolve around him. The journal painted a picture of a community in rapid decline, families packing their belongings and leaving almost daily as the silver mines that supported Millfield played out one by one. July 20th, 1892. Dr. Matthews stopped by to settle his account before leaving for California. He said I should come with him, that there's nothing left here worth saving. But he's wrong. There's plenty worth saving. It's just not the kind of thing you can load in a wagon. August 3rd, 1892. Found myself talking to the empty chairs today. Asked them what they thought of the weather. They didn't have much to say. Think I'm losing my mind, but it's better than the silence. The entries grew more philosophical as Morrison's isolation deepened, but Jake noticed something else. References to preserving what matters most and securing the future became increasingly frequent. Morrison seemed to be working on some kind of project, something he believed would outlast the town's abandonment. August 15th, 1892. Finished the work today. God willing, someone worthy will find what I've hidden and understand its importance. Not the fools and scavengers who'll come looking for easy pickings, but someone who sees the value in what we built here. August 22nd, 1892, last entry. Thompson's freight wagon comes tomorrow to take me to the railroad. I'm leaving everything exactly as it is, just in case someone comes back someday who remembers what Millfield was supposed to be. The journal ended there. But tucked between the final pages, Jake found a folded piece of paper covered with Morrison's careful handwriting. It was a letter, apparently never sent, addressed to his brother in St. Louis. Dear William, by the time you read this, I'll be gone from Millfield and probably from this world entirely. I'm not a young man anymore, and starting over at 62 seems more burden than blessing. But I want you to know that I don't regret a single day I spent in this place. We built something beautiful here, even if it didn't last as long as we hoped. The silver ran out, but the dreams we invested in this valley are buried deeper than any mine shaft. Someday, God willing, someone will dig them up again. Your brother. Samuel Jake closed the journal carefully and sat back on his heels, feeling as if he'd just been introduced to the ghost of the man who'd once run this establishment. Morrison's story was both heartbreaking and inspiring. A man who'd refused to abandon his post, even as his world crumbled around him. Lucky, meanwhile, had moved to a different section of floor and was pawing insistently at another loose board. This one was even more obviously out of place than the first, and when Jake pried it up, he found more oiled canvas packages waiting in the darkness below. Before he could investigate further, the sound of a car engine interrupted his exploration. Jake looked up to see an expensive SUV pulling up in front of the saloon, the same vehicle Linda Morrison had been driving at the courthouse auction. Mr. Porter? Linda called as she approached the saloon entrance. I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. Jake quickly replaced the loose floorboard and stood to greet her. Not at all, ma'am. Just doing some exploring. Linda stepped through the batwing doors and whistled softly as she looked around the saloon's interior. My goodness, this place is in better shape than I expected. The family stories made it sound like it was falling down. Family stories? Oh, didn't I mention? Samuel Morrison was my great-great-grandfather. This saloon has been in our family lore for generations, though nobody's been back here in decades. She ran her hand along the mahogany bar, her expression thoughtful. Great-great-grandmother used to tell stories about how beautiful this place was, how it was the finest establishment between Denver and Salt Lake City. Jake felt a chill of coincidence. Your ancestor left quite a legacy behind. This is some of the finest craftsmanship I've ever seen, which is actually why I'm here, Linda said, turning to face him with the businesslike expression he remembered from their first meeting. I've been doing some research since we talked, and I've had several clients express interest in Millfield. Not for development, for restoration. There's a growing market for authentic Western towns, especially ones with this kind of historical significance. She named a figure that made Jake's breath catch. 10 times what he'd paid for the entire town, just for the saloon building alone. That's a generous offer, Jake managed, and that's just the beginning. If you're willing to sell the whole town, I've got a client who'll pay serious money, enough for you to buy a nice ranch somewhere and live comfortably for the rest of your life. Jake looked around the saloon, trying to imagine it stripped of its authenticity and turned into a tourist attraction. The thought made something twist in his stomach. I appreciate the interest, ma'am, but I'm not ready to sell just yet. Still figuring out what I've gotten myself into. Linda nodded, but Jake could see she wasn't entirely satisfied with his answer. I understand, but don't wait too long. Opportunities like this don't stay on the table forever. After she left, Jake returned to the loose floorboard, where Lucky was still standing guard. The horse looked at him with an expression that seemed almost reproachful, as if to say, "We've got work to do, and you're wasting time talking to strangers." After Linda's visit, Jake found himself staring at the loose floorboard with new urgency. Lucky had been trying to tell him something for over a week, and now, with Morrison's journal fresh in his mind and strangers already sniffing around with offers to buy, Jake felt the weight of unfinished business pressing down on him. "All right, Lucky," he said, kneeling beside the persistent horse. "Let's see what Samuel Morrison thought was worth hiding." This time, Jake pried up not just one board, but 3 adjacent planks, revealing a rectangular opening in the floor, large enough to accommodate something substantial. His flashlight beam illuminated the corners of a metal container, not just wrapped packages like the journal, but something more significant. Jake reached down with both hands and lifted out a heavy iron strongbox, roughly the size of a small suitcase, but built like a fortress. The metal was darkened with age, but free of rust, and the lock mechanism appeared to be intact. The box was surprisingly heavy, as if packed with something dense and valuable. There was no key visible, but when Jake examined the lock more closely, he discovered it wasn't secured. The mechanism had been left open, waiting. Morrison had hidden this box not to keep people out, but to keep its contents safe until the right person found it. Jake lifted the lid with trembling hands. Inside, wrapped in more oiled canvas, were stacks and stacks of formal-looking documents. Each one was printed on heavy paper with elaborate borders and official seals. Jake lifted out the top document and unfolded it carefully. "Territory of Colorado Railroad Development Bond," he read aloud. "Bearer bond in the amount of $5,000. Series 1889. Lucky nickered softly, as if encouraging Jake to continue. The box contained dozens of similar documents, railroad bonds, mining company certificates, territorial development securities, all dating from the 1880s and early 1890s. Some were for amounts as small as $1,000, others for as much as $10,000. All of them were bearer bonds, meaning they belonged to whoever physically possessed them. Jake had heard of such things but had never seen one in person. During the late 1800s, these bonds had been a way for territorial governments and large companies to raise capital for major projects. They paid interest to whoever held them and could be redeemed for their full face value by anyone who presented them to the issuing authority. But that was over a century ago. These bonds were historical curiosities now, probably worth nothing more than their value to collectors of old paper. Still, something about Morrison's careful preservation of these documents, his references to securing the future, suggested they might be more significant than they appeared. Jake counted the bonds carefully, 43 separate documents with a combined face value of over $200,000 in 1890s money. "What do you think, Lucky?" Jake asked. "Worth a trip to town to find out what these are really worth?" Lucky pawed at the floor beside the open strongbox, then looked directly at Jake with an expression that seemed almost human in its intensity. Jake carefully repacked the bonds in their oiled canvas wrapping and placed them back in the strongbox. He carried the entire container to his truck, secured it behind the seat, and loaded Lucky into the trailer for what was becoming a familiar trip to Cedar Falls. The Cedar Falls Public Library had internet access and a helpful librarian named Mrs. Patterson who seemed genuinely interested in Jake's research project. He explained that he'd found some old territorial bonds and wanted to know if they had any current value. "Oh, how exciting!" Mrs. Patterson exclaimed. "Territorial bonds are quite rare. Most were redeemed decades ago, but occasionally someone discovers a cache that was forgotten or lost. Let's see what we can find out." She helped Jake set up at a computer terminal and showed him how to search for information about historic bond redemption. What they discovered made Jake's head spin. The territory of Colorado had been required by federal law to honor all outstanding bonds when it achieved statehood. More importantly, these bonds had been backed by the full faith and credit of what eventually became the state of Colorado. They'd never been officially cancelled or declared worthless. According to this, Mrs. Patterson said, reading over Jake's shoulder, these bonds would have continued to accrue interest even if they were never redeemed. "Look here. It says the standard rate was 6% annually, compounded." Jake stared at the computer screen, trying to process what he was seeing. "You mean they're still earning interest after all these years?" "If they're legitimate, and if they were never redeemed, then theoretically yes. But you'd need to have them authenticated by an expert to be sure." Mrs. Patterson helped Jake find contact information for several specialists in historic securities. One was a firm in Denver that dealt specifically with unclaimed territorial and railroad bonds. Jake called from the library's phone, explained his situation, and was told to bring the bonds in for evaluation as soon as possible. The drive to Denver normally would have taken 3 hours. Jake made it in 2.5, his mind racing with possibilities and fears in equal measure. The specialist, a man named Dr. Richard Caldwell, met Jake at his office in downtown Denver and examined the bonds with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious relics. "Extraordinary," Dr. Caldwell murmured, holding one of the railroad bonds up to the light. "The paper is authentic, the printing is period correct, the seals are genuine. These are legitimate territorial securities, no question about it. But are they worth anything?" Jake asked. Dr. Caldwell smiled. "Mr. Porter, you're holding what may be the largest cache of unredeemed territorial bonds ever discovered. The state of Colorado has a legal obligation to honor these, including accumulated interest." He paused to check calculations on his computer. "Based on the face values you've shown me and the interest rates specified in the bond agreements, I estimate the current redemption value at approximately $215 million. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He sat down heavily in Dr. Caldwell's office chair, staring at the stack of old papers on the desk. $200 million? Give or take a few million, depending on the exact calculation methods the state uses for compound interest over this time period. But yes, you're looking at a fortune that would put you among the wealthiest individuals in Colorado." Jake's hands were shaking as he carefully returned the bonds to their strongbox. Dr. Caldwell provided him with documentation of the bond's authenticity and advised him to contact both a securities lawyer and an accountant before proceeding with any redemption process. The drive back to Millfield passed in a blur. Jake's mind couldn't seem to grasp the magnitude of what had happened. This morning he'd been a broke cowboy living in a ghost town with $10 to his name. Tonight he was sitting on a fortune that could buy him anything he wanted for the rest of his life. By the time he reached Millfield, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the abandoned town in shades of gold and purple that seemed almost otherworldly. Jake unloaded Lucky and stood in the middle of Main Street, looking at the collection of empty buildings with completely different eyes. He could buy a ranch, not just any ranch, but the finest ranch in Colorado. He could travel the world, live anywhere he wanted, never worry about money again. He could give Sarah everything she'd ever wanted, maybe even win her back. The possibilities were endless, but as Jake looked at Morrison's saloon, where Lucky was already taking up his evening post, he felt something else entirely. Samuel Morrison had hidden those bonds for a reason. He'd preserved them through Millfield's collapse, wrapped them carefully, and left them for someone who would understand their true significance. The money was life-changing, certainly, but Morrison's real legacy wasn't the bonds themselves. It was the trust he'd placed in whoever would eventually find them. The faith that someday someone would care enough about Millfield to uncover its buried treasures. Jake carried the strongbox into the general store and set it on the counter next to Morrison's journal. Two artifacts from a man who'd refused to abandon his post even when his world was ending. Two gifts from the past that somehow felt more like responsibilities than windfalls. Outside, Lucky whinnied softly in the darkness, and Jake realized that everything was about to change. The question was whether that change would honor Samuel Morrison's faith or betray it entirely. Jake had hoped to keep the discovery of the bonds quiet while he figured out what to do with them. But small towns have long memories and even longer tongues. Within 48 hours of his return from Denver, word had somehow spread that the broke cowboy, who'd bought a ghost town for $10, had found something valuable buried beneath its floors. The first sign of trouble arrived in the form of a black sedan with tinted windows that pulled up in front of the general store early Thursday morning. Two men in expensive suits emerged, looking thoroughly out of place in the dusty, abandoned town. Jake watched from the store's window as they walked slowly down Main Street, taking photographs and making notes on tablets. When they approached the store, Jake stepped outside to meet them. "Morning, gentlemen. You're on private property." The older of the two men smiled with practiced corporate charm. "Mr. Porter, I presume. I'm David Hartwell from Hartwell Development Corporation. This is my associate Marcus Chen. We understand you've made quite an interesting discovery." Jake kept his expression neutral. "Don't know what you're talking about." Of course. May we have a word?" "We're prepared to make you a very substantial offer for your property here." Despite his misgivings, Jake invited them into the general store. Hartwell looked around the sparse interior with the calculating gaze of a man who saw dollar signs instead of history. Chen set up a tablet computer on the wooden counter and pulled up what appeared to be architectural renderings. "Mr. Porter, Hartwell Development specializes in creating authentic Western experiences for the tourism market," Hartwell began. "Millfield has tremendous potential as a destination resort. Imagine, if you will, a completely restored frontier town with luxury accommodations, fine dining, and entertainment venues that capture the romance of the Old West." Chen turned the tablet so Jake could see the renderings. What he saw made his stomach turn. The images showed Millfield transformed into a theme park version of itself. Main Street widened to accommodate tour buses. The historic buildings gutted and rebuilt as gift shops and restaurants. A hotel complex rising behind the original structures like a cancer. "We're prepared to offer you $12 million for the entire township," Hartwell continued. "Cash, with a 30-day closing. You'd be free to stay on as a consultant if you wished. Perhaps as our authentic cowboy for tourist interactions." Jake studied the renderings more closely, noting how every trace of Millfield's actual history had been sanitized and commercialized. Morrison's saloon had been reimagined as the Silver Dollar Casino. The church had become Weddings by the Creek Chapel. The general store where Jake now lived was labeled Frontier Trading Post and Souvenir Shop. "What about the town's actual history?" Jake asked. "The people who lived here, the stories they left behind?" Hartwell waved dismissively. "History is fine, Mr. Porter, but tourists want entertainment. They want to feel like they're experiencing the Old West without any of the actual hardship or authenticity that might make them uncomfortable. We'd preserve the important bits, of course, but in a way that's accessible to modern families." Chen closed the tablet and handed Jake a thick folder. "These are the preliminary contracts and financial projections. As you can see, $12 million is just the initial payment. If our revenue projections are accurate, there could be significant additional compensation down the line." After they left, Jake sat alone in the general store, staring at the folder without opening it. $12 million would solve every financial problem he'd ever had or ever would have. But the images on Chen's tablet kept flashing through his mind. Millfield transformed from a ghost town into a ghost of itself. His solitude didn't last long. By afternoon, a steady stream of visitors began arriving. Linda Morrison returned with a team of people she introduced as heritage preservation specialists, though their interest seemed more focused on profit margins than historical accuracy. A group claiming to represent descendants of Millfield's original families arrived with demands that any treasure found in the town be shared with them as rightful heirs. The most persistent visitor was a man named Theodore Van Camp, who introduced himself as a recovery specialist and claimed that territorial bonds found on former railroad land technically belonged to the federal government. He presented Jake with papers that looked official but made little legal sense, demanding that the bonds be turned over to federal authorities for proper evaluation. By evening, Jake had received offers ranging from the ridiculous, a man who wanted to trade a used RV for half the town, to the sublime, a woman who represented a consortium of investors willing to pay $15 million for development rights while allowing Jake to retain ownership of the land. Each visitor brought their own vision for Millfield's future. A Hollywood producer wanted to turn it into a movie set. A tech entrepreneur envisioned it as a digital detox resort for burned-out executives. A religious group saw it as the perfect location for a spiritual retreat center. What none of them seemed to understand was that Jake hadn't been looking for any of this. He'd bought Millfield as a place to disappear, not as an investment opportunity. The discovery of Morrison's bonds had changed everything, but not necessarily in ways he wanted. As night fell and the last of the day's visitors departed, Jake found himself standing on Main Street with Lucky, looking at the town with eyes that had seen too much in the past few days. The silence that had once been comforting now felt fragile, as if it could be shattered at any moment by the arrival of more people with more plans for his accidental fortune. "What do you think, Lucky?" Jake asked. "Think Samuel Morrison would approve of any of these ideas?" Lucky's response was to walk directly to the saloon and take up his usual post. The horse had been remarkably calm throughout the day's chaos, as if he understood that all the visitors and their grand plans were irrelevant to whatever was really important about this place. Jake followed Lucky to the saloon and sat on the front steps, Morrison's journal in his hands. He'd been rereading it in quiet moments, trying to understand what the old saloon keeper had really intended. When he buried those bonds, Morrison's final entries spoke of preserving what matters most and leaving something for someone worthy who would understand the town's true value. But what had Morrison valued? The buildings themselves, the community that had once thrived here, the dreams and hopes that had been invested in this remote valley. As Jake read by flashlight, one passage stood out more than the others. "We built something beautiful here, even if it didn't last as long as we hoped. The silver ran out, but the dreams we invested in this valley are buried deeper than any mine shaft. Someday, God willing, someone will dig them up again. Dreams buried deeper than mine shafts." Jake looked around at the dark silhouettes of the surrounding buildings, trying to see them through Morrison's eyes. Not as investment opportunities or development projects, but as monuments to human hope and determination. The people who'd built Millfield hadn't come here to get rich quick and leave. They'd come to create something lasting, something that would outlive them. They'd invested not just money, but their lives, their relationships, their futures in this place. When the silver ran out, they'd had to abandon their dreams. But they'd left behind evidence of what they'd tried to accomplish. Morrison's bonds weren't just money. They were a trust fund for those dreams, a way to finish what the original settlers had started, to honor the vision they'd had to abandon. But honoring that vision would mean more than just restoring the buildings. It would mean creating something authentic, something that respected the town's history rather than exploiting it, something that would attract people who appreciated craftsmanship and community, Rather than just entertainment and consumption, Jake spent the rest of the evening walking through Millfield's empty streets, imagining different futures. In one scenario, he took Hartwell's 12 million and disappeared, leaving the town to be transformed into a theme park. In another, he used Morrison's bonds to restore the town himself, turning it into something that honored its past while serving a meaningful purpose in the present. The second option would be far more difficult. It would require years of work, careful planning, and a commitment that would tie him to this place for the rest of his life. There would be setbacks, complications, moments when he'd question his sanity for choosing difficulty over ease. But as Jake stood in front of Morrison's saloon, watching Lucky maintain his faithful vigil, he realized the choice had already been made, not by logic or financial calculation, but by something deeper. The same instinct that had guided Lucky to the hidden strongbox. The same faith that had motivated Morrison to preserve those bonds through decades of abandonment. Tomorrow, representatives from Hartwell Development would return for his answer. Other offers would pour in as word continued to spread about his discovery. Pressure would mount from all sides to make the smart financial decision. But tonight, Jake Porter knew exactly what Samuel Morrison would have wanted him to do. The only question was whether he had the courage to do it. The Hartwell Development team arrived at precisely 9 o'clock, Friday morning, in a convoy of black SUVs that looked like a presidential motorcade invading the quiet streets of Millfield. David Hartwell emerged from the lead vehicle carrying a leather briefcase, followed by Marcus Chen with his ever-present tablet, and 3 additional associates Jake hadn't met before. "Mr. Porter," Hartwell called out with the booming confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? Perfect weather for making history." Jake had spent the dawn hours sitting on the front porch of the general store, Lucky grazing peacefully in the street nearby, watching the sun rise over the mountains and thinking about the choice he was about to make. Now, as Hartwell's team spread out across Main Street like an occupying force, Jake felt the weight of that decision settling into his bones. "Gentlemen," Jake said, standing to greet them. "Right on time." Hartwell's smile was predatory. "We don't waste time when there's money to be made, Mr. Porter. Shall we get down to business?" The presentation took place in Morrison's saloon, which struck Jake as somehow appropriate. Hartwell had brought a portable projector and screen, transforming the historic bar room into a corporate conference room. As the old building filled with the hum of electronic equipment and the chatter of business negotiations, Jake could almost feel Samuel Morrison's ghost recoiling in horror. Chen began with financial projections that made Jake's head spin. Construction costs, revenue estimates, tourist traffic models, profit margins, all presented with the slick confidence of men who turned places into products for a living. Phase 1 involves the complete restoration and modernization of the existing structures, Chen explained, pointing to architectural drawings that bore no resemblance to the buildings Jake had come to know. "We'll preserve the external facades for authenticity while completely rebuilding the interiors to meet modern safety and comfort standards." Jake watched the presentation unfold with growing dismay. Every slide showed another layer of Millfield's soul being stripped away in favor of commercial appeal. The creek that ran through town would be channeled and enhanced with artificial waterfalls. The residential buildings would be converted to luxury hotel suites with names like the Prospector's Palace and Silver Strike Sanctuary. Even the church would be transformed into an event venue for authentic frontier weddings. The centerpiece, of course, will be Morrison's casino and saloon, Hartwell said, gesturing grandly around the room where they sat. "We'll create an immersive gambling experience that captures the excitement and danger of the Old West, complete with period-dressed dealers and staged gunfights in the street." As the presentation continued, Jake found himself looking at Lucky through the saloon's front window. The horse stood calmly in the morning sunlight, occasionally swishing his tail at flies, completely indifferent to the corporate invasion happening around him. There was something profoundly reassuring about Lucky's presence. a reminder that authenticity couldn't be manufactured or marketed. When the presentation concluded, Hartwell leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who just delivered a knockout punch. "So, Mr. Porter, what do you say? Ready to become a very wealthy man?" Jake stood up slowly, walked to the mahogany bar where Morrison had once served drinks to hard-working miners and hopeful settlers, and ran his hand along the smooth wood. Behind the bar, the antique mirror reflected his weather-beaten face back at him, and for a moment he could see Morrison standing in the same spot over a century ago, facing his own impossible choice. "Gentlemen," Jake said, turning to face the development team, "I appreciate the time and effort you've put into this proposal. I truly do. But I'm afraid I can't accept your offer." The silence that followed was deafening. Chen's fingers froze over his tablet. Two of the associates exchanged glances of disbelief. Hartwell's corporate smile faltered for the first time since Jake had met him. "I'm sorry," Hartwell said carefully. "Did you say you're rejecting $12 million? "I did. Mr. Porter, perhaps you need more time to consider." "No," Jake interrupted. "I've had all the time I need. This town isn't for sale. Not to you, not to anyone else who wants to turn it into something it was never meant to be." Jake walked to the general store and returned with a handwritten letter he'd composed that morning. He handed it to Hartwell, who read it with increasing incredulity. "You're announcing your intention to restore Millfield yourself?" Hartwell asked. "Mr. Porter, do you have any idea what that would cost? What it would take to bring utilities, roads and modern amenities to a place this remote?" "I've got some idea," Jake replied, "and I've got the resources to do it right." "Resources?" One of the unnamed associates laughed harshly. "You bought this place for $10. What resources could you possibly have?" Jake smiled. "The kind that matter. The kind that can't be bought or sold, only earned." Hartwell's professional demeanor cracked completely. "This is insane." "You're throwing away the chance of a lifetime for what? Some sentimental attachment to a bunch of old buildings? Mr. Porter, sentiment doesn't pay bills. It doesn't create jobs or bring prosperity to a region." "You're right about one thing," Jake said. "This is about sentiment, but not the cheap manufactured kind you're selling. This is about respect. Respect for the people who built this place, for the dreams they invested here, for the legacy they left behind." As the Hartwell team packed up their equipment in disgusted silence, Jake found himself thinking about Morrison's final journal entry, about dreams buried deeper than mine shafts. The old saloon keeper had hidden those bonds not as an investment opportunity, but as a trust fund for those dreams. Now it was Jake's responsibility to honor that trust. Word of Jake's rejection of the Hartwell offer spread through the region faster than a wildfire in drought season. Within a week, the story had been picked up by newspapers across Colorado, and Jake found himself fielding calls from reporters, historians, and curious citizens who wanted to know more about the broke cowboy who'd turned down millions to restore a ghost town. The attention brought both supporters and detractors. Letters arrived daily, some praising Jake's vision and others calling him a fool. A group of architecture students from the University of Colorado drove out to see the town and ended up volunteering their time to help document the existing structures. Local craftsmen, many of them descendants of the artisans who'd built similar towns throughout the Colorado Territory, offered their services at cost. But the most meaningful support came from an unexpected source, the descendants of Millfield's original families, the same people who'd initially demanded a share of any treasure found in the town. Martha Henderson, whose great-grandfather had run the town's general store, arrived one morning with a truck full of her family's photographs and documents. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Porter," she said, spreading daguerreotypes across the counter of the very store her ancestor had operated. "When I heard about what you'd found, my first thought was about money. But after hearing what you plan to do with this place, I realized you're trying to honor our family's memory, not exploit it." The photographs Martha brought were revelations. Jake saw Millfield not just as it appeared in the formal street scene he'd found earlier, but as a living community. Children playing in the schoolyard, women hanging laundry behind neat houses, Men gathered around the blacksmith's forge, watching him shape horseshoes on his anvil. These weren't posed tourist shots, they were glimpses into the daily life of a town that had been as real as any community. Today, Jake worked with a local architect named Elena Santos to create restoration plans that honored the original builders' intentions while meeting modern safety requirements. Elena specialized in historic preservation and understood immediately what Jake was trying to accomplish. Most people who restore ghost towns either turn them into museums or tourist attractions. Elena explained as they walked through Morrison's saloon, measuring spaces and noting structural details. But you're talking about creating a living town again. That's incredibly ambitious. The architectural plans Elena developed were works of art in themselves. Hand-drawn blueprints that showed not just how to repair and restore each building, but how to integrate modern necessities, electrical systems, plumbing, internet connectivity, without compromising the structure's historic integrity. Jake's first major project was Morrison's Saloon, partly because of its central importance to the town's history, and partly because Lucky seemed to consider himself the project's supervisor. The horse had taken to following the work crews around, observing their progress with the critical eye of a quality control inspector. The craftsmen Jake hired were cut from the same cloth as the men who'd built Millfield originally. Tom Brennan, a master carpenter whose grandfather had worked on similar buildings throughout Colorado, approached each timber with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "Look at this joinery work," Tom said one morning, pointing to the intricate woodwork that connected the saloon's support beams. No nails, no screws, just perfectly cut mortise and tenon joints that have held solid for over a century. They built this place to last forever. The restoration process revealed layers of history that hadn't been visible to casual observers. Behind a false wall in the saloon's back room, workers discovered original murals painted by traveling artists. Under decades of accumulated grime on the bar's surface, they found inlaid wood patterns that told the story of the town's founding. But the discovery that moved Jake most was found in the church bell tower. Hidden beneath loose floorboards was a time capsule left by Millfield's last minister, containing letters from townspeople to future generations. One letter, written by a young woman named Mary Catherine Walsh, brought tears to Jake's eyes. "To whoever finds this, we are leaving our beautiful town, not because we stop believing in it, but because we can no longer afford to stay. The silver is gone, but the love we put into this place will remain in every board, every stone, every tree we planted. If you are reading this, it means someone cared enough to come back. Please know that we never wanted to leave, and we pray that someday Millfield will be home to families again." The restoration work proceeded despite constant harassment from Hartwell Development and other disappointed investors. Lawyers arrived with cease and desist orders based on questionable environmental and zoning claims. County inspectors showed up demanding permits for work that didn't require permits. Anonymous complaints were filed with various regulatory agencies, each one requiring Jake to halt work, while bureaucrats investigated claims that invariably proved groundless. Through it all, Lucky remained a constant presence, moving from building to building as work progressed, somehow managing to stay out of the way while keeping close watch on everything that happened. The work crews came to regard the horse as their unofficial mascot, and several admitted they felt more confident in their work after Lucky had inspected and apparently approved their efforts. The first breakthrough came 6 months after restoration began, when Tom Brennan's crew finished work on Morrison's Saloon's main room. As Jake walked through the space that evening, he could hardly believe the transformation. The mahogany bar gleamed with renewed luster. The antique mirror reflected light from restored gas fixtures that had been converted to electricity while maintaining their original appearance. The hardwood floors, revealed from beneath decades of dirt and neglect, showed the rich patina that only comes from years of honest use. But more than the physical beauty, the room felt alive again. It felt ready to welcome people, to serve its original purpose as the heart of a community. standing in the doorway with Lucky beside him. Jake could almost hear the echo of voices from Millfield's past. And for the first time since beginning this impossible project, he began to believe it might actually work. 18 months after Jake Porter bought a ghost town for $10, he stood on the front porch of what was now officially called the Millfield General Store and Inn, watching the sun set behind mountains that had witnessed both the town's death and its resurrection. In his hands was a framed photograph that would hang in Morrison's saloon alongside the historical images Martha Henderson had donated, a then and now comparison that told the story of an impossible dream made real. The then image showed Millfield as Jake had first found it. Empty buildings with boarded windows, weeds growing in the street, silence heavy as mountain snow. The now image, taken just that morning, revealed a living community once again. Children played in the dusty street, under the watchful eyes of parents who'd moved to Millfield seeking something authentic in an increasingly artificial world. Smoke rose from the chimneys of houses that had stood empty for 60 years, but now sheltered families who'd been drawn by the town's unique blend of history and hope. Lucky grazed peacefully in the meadow beyond the residential district, no longer needing to stand guard over buried secrets. The horse had settled into the routine of a small-town celebrity, accepting carrots from visiting children and posing patiently for photographs, with tourists who'd driven hours to see the restored ghost town that had captured the nation's imagination. Restoration had taken longer and cost more than Jake had initially projected, but the territorial bonds Samuel Morrison had so carefully preserved had proven more than adequate to fund the project. Morrison's saloon, now restored to its 1890s grandeur, served craft beer and authentic frontier cuisine to visitors who came seeking genuine Western atmosphere rather than theme park entertainment. The general store operated as both a working business and a comfortable inn for guests who wanted to experience small-town life at its most fundamental level. Dr. Elena Santos had accepted Jake's offer to become Millfield's first official town planner, tasked with managing growth while preserving the community's authentic character. Her office was in the old assay building, where she worked with potential new residents to ensure that anyone who moved to Millfield understood and committed to maintaining its unique spirit. The church had been restored to its original purpose, serving a small but devoted congregation that included both long-term residents and newcomers who'd been drawn to the town's spiritual atmosphere. The old schoolhouse once again echoed with children's voices, though now it operated as a one-room school that attracted families interested in alternative education approaches. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the sense of community that had developed among Millfield's new residents. Unlike typical tourist destinations, where visitors remained separate from local life, Millfield had somehow managed to create an environment where newcomers and temporary visitors became part of the town's ongoing story. Jake's role had evolved from property owner to something like a benevolent mayor. Though the title had never been formally bestowed, people came to him with problems and disputes, seeking the kind of practical wisdom that comes from having lost everything and found something better. He'd discovered that his experience with failure and recovery made him uniquely qualified to help others navigate their own challenges. The success had brought its own complications. Magazine articles and television features had attracted attention from developers and investors who still couldn't understand why Jake had chosen difficult authenticity over easy profit. Offers continued to arrive regularly, some reaching astronomical amounts, but Jake had learned to dispose of them without consideration. The money from Morrison's bonds had been placed in a trust fund dedicated to Millfield's long-term maintenance and growth. Jake drew a modest salary as the town's caretaker, enough to live comfortably, but not enough to separate him from the community he'd helped create. The rest of the fortune remained invested, generating income that funded scholarships, historical preservation projects, and community improvements. On this particular evening, Jake reflected on a conversation he'd had that morning with a reporter from a national magazine. She'd asked him if he ever regretted turning down the Hartwell offer, if he ever wondered what his life would have been like with $12 million in the bank. "Ma'am," Jake had replied, "I've learned the difference between being rich and being wealthy. Rich is what you have in the bank. Wealthy is what you have when you wake up in the morning." As darkness settled over the valley, lights began to appear in windows throughout Millfield, warm, yellow glows that spoke of families gathered around dinner tables, children being read bedtime stories, neighbors sharing the quiet satisfaction of another day well lived. The sight never failed to move Jake, knowing that each light represented a family that had chosen to make their home in this remote valley because they valued community over convenience, authenticity over entertainment. A horse's gentle nicker drew Jake's attention to Lucky, who had wandered back from the meadow and was standing in front of Morrison's saloon, just as he had during those early days when the town's secrets were still buried beneath its floors. But now, the horse's vigil had a different quality, not the urgent intensity of a guardian protecting hidden treasure, but the peaceful contentment of a creature at home in his proper place. Jake walked over to Lucky and scratched behind his ears, thinking about all the paths that had led to this moment. The loss of his ranch, which had seemed like the end of everything, had actually been the beginning of something far more meaningful. The divorce that had broken his heart had freed him to discover a different kind of love, the deep satisfaction that comes from serving something larger than yourself. "What do you think, Lucky?" Jake asked, looking around at the town they'd helped bring back to life. "Think Samuel Morrison would approve of what we've done with his investment?" Lucky's response was to lean into Jake's touch, a gesture of contentment and trust that spoke more eloquently than any words could have. Together, they stood in the street where Jake had first heard the profound silence of abandonment, now filled with the gentle sounds of a community at peace, wind chimes on front porches, the distant laughter of children, the creak of rocking chairs on the inn's front porch. As the last light faded from the western peaks, Jake realized he'd found something in Millfield that he'd never known he was looking for. Not just a home, but a purpose. Not just a place to live, but a legacy worth leaving. And in the darkness that settled gently over the valley, illuminated by the warm glow of lit windows and the brilliant scatter of mountain stars, Jake Porter finally understood what Samuel Morrison had known all those years ago. Some treasures are worth more than their weight in gold, and the most valuable discoveries are the ones that can't be spent, only shared.